We are in, well, we're kind of in Daniel chapter 11, but we're primarily talking about history that is not so much covered in the scriptures. We're looking at the time between the testaments, and in particular we're looking at Greece and the empires that arose out of Greece and how those things impacted the Jewish people. We've been starting to talk about the Hasmonean dynasty, but I discovered this week in the course of kind of preparing for today that I have been mispronouncing what I had called the word Seleucid, which is the empire that was controlling Jerusalem and Judea at this time. The correct pronunciation is actually Seleucid Empire. The C that I thought was an S sound is actually a K sound. I discovered that when I started watching a video about this that was helpful in other ways as well. And the guy kept pronouncing it Seleucid, and I thought, what a moron. And then I went and did actually a phonetic check and realized that the K in the middle of that meant that the sound was K and not S. So anyway, so I'm going to probably mispronounce it a few more times because I've been calling it that for years now, but it is actually the Seleucids is the name of the Greek, the portion of the Greek Empire that was in control of Judea during this time. And the king of the, and this I'm more confident about his name, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is the king of the Seleucid Empire who is controlling Jerusalem, who is trying to convert the Jews into worshippers of Greek gods and Greek culture. He goes to, twice he fights battles against Egypt. The second time he gets sent back by the Romans in a very humiliating fashion, and he takes it out on the Jews by stopping off there and basically imposing Greek law and Greek rules and Greek customs, outlining all practice of the Jewish religion, and installing an abomination of desolation, which is an altar to Zeus Olympus in the temple, as opposed to the daily sacrifice. So the Jews are no longer able to sacrifice or practice their religion in any way, and to make matters even worse, he has set up an altar to Zeus, thus desecrating the temple in the process as well. And so last week we looked in Daniel chapter 11, where Daniel says the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give in understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So basically what he's talking about is a rebellion against, previously in chapter 11, he's been talking about the king of the north who's going to set up the abomination of desolation, which we can identify with the Antiochus IV. Then he begins talking about a rebellion against them, that rebellion is going to be subject to persecution, but that they're going to have some success, and that some are going to join with him, and he says in hypocrisy, which suggests that some of the people who are joining in the rebellion are maybe not legitimately followers of God so much as they are simply loving themselves and feeling like this is some way that they're going to get some advancement there. And so when we look at history, what happens as a result of the actions of Antiochus IV is what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And the Maccabean Revolt is led by a guy named Mattathias ben Johanan, who is a priest of the Hasmonean family. Now, by priest, that means he's a descendant of who?
But you have to be Aaron.
Have to be Aaron. So he's not just a Levite, he's an actual priest, which means he's qualified to hold the high priesthood depending on who's in front of him in the lineage there, who's closest to Aaron. But he is a priest of the Hasmonean family. The Hasmonean family is, they are a family of priests. Over time, of course, as the various tribes and families within those tribes grew in number, what you had happening in Aaron's lineage, just like everybody else was, as it expanded, there became sort of families that became part of the priestly tribe. So the Hasmoneans were one, there were other ones as well, but the Hasmoneans become the most important ones in the context of Jewish history, although perhaps not in terms of biblical history. But in 167, Mattathias, at this point, Antiochus IV has instituted a requirement that the Jews, not only can they not worship Jehovah God, they must worship these pagan gods. And so in his hometown of Modean, Mattathias is ordered to offer sacrifice, because he's a priest, to offer a sacrifice to Zeus. Actually, he and another priest are ordered to do this. And when they are called upon to do this, and the other priest starts to do it, Mattathias executes him summarily and refuses to do it, leads a localized revolt against the Greeks that are there, who were probably not really prepared for somebody to suddenly start killing them. So he leads a revolt and then takes his family and runs into the mountains. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So he rebelled against the Greek sacrifice. He led his sons into the mountains near Modean, and he started a guerrilla campaign against the Greeks and the Syrian Greeks, basically. So he begins this revolt in 167. Now, Mattathias had 5 sons, actually, or at least 5 sons that are recorded in history. The first one was a guy named John Gotti. He should not be confused with John Gotti, the mobster, the notorious gangster and boss of the Gambino crime family. That is someone completely different. His name is spelled G-O-T-T-I. John Gotti, the son of Mattathias, is G-A-D-D-I. John Gotti will die in 160, so he will die about 6 or 7 years after this revolution begins. His second son was Simon Thassi. His third son was Judas Maccabeus. His fourth was Eleazar Avarin, and his fifth was Jonathan Apphus. So he has these 5 sons. Now, he starts the revolution in 167, but he is killed in 166 during some kind of a conflict, and so his son takes over. His son is Judas Maccabeus, and it becomes Hammer time. And again, not the rapper MC Hammer, who's a trailblazing rap and hip-hop artist from the 80s and 90s, but rather Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus, the name Maccabeus literally means the hammer. So this guy's name was Judas the Hammer. And I'm guessing it wasn't because he liked woodcraft. It seems like he was a fairly violent guy and was pretty good at fighting battles and wars, and so he becomes known as the Hammer. Whoa, I'm in trouble here. There we go. Okay, so Judas Maccabeus takes over and leads the guerrilla campaign. For the next 6 years, from 166 to 160, he leads the Jews in this campaign against the Seleucid Greeks that are in control. And he fights a series of battles. The Battle of the Ascent of Labona, which the Maccabeans are successful, but they're not fighting large-scale battles. This is a lot like, in some ways, the American Revolutionary War. If you know very much about the American Revolutionary War, you know that when it started out, it was not pitched battles between continental armies of the British and the Americans, because the Americans didn't have anything like that. It was guerrilla campaigns of small groups of Americans sneaking around and coming up and attacking the British where they weren't expecting it, or where their forces were weak, crippling or damaging their supply lines, and then running away again. And in a lot of ways, the same kind of thing is being done here. They are fighting that same kind of campaign where their smaller numbers are being used to infiltrate, to sneak around, to cause damage, and then sort of fade away. And so most of these battles, like the Battle of the Ascent of Labona, are small-scale battles where it's only a relatively small number of the Greek troops against usually most of the army of the Maccabeans, but it's fought in terrain that favors them and on terms that favor them. The second one is the Battle of Beth Zur, and again, they win this, but these are not decisive battles. These are just kind of battles that kind of keep things moving along. And then there's the Battle of Emmaus, and Emmaus is important for a different reason. Anybody remember why Emmaus is significant in the Bible?
Sounds familiar, but I can't remember.
It should sound familiar too. It is the story of the road to Emmaus. Anybody think that sort of jog anybody's memory here?
With the donkey?
Nope.
Jesus met some.
There you go.
Oh,
Jesus,
yeah.
after his resurrection, met a couple of the apostles
Yeah.
on the road from, or to or from Emmaus, I forget which one. And it's almost certainly the same Emmaus, because by this time, the names of things are pretty similar to what they're going to be by the time Jesus gets there, with the exception of a few things that the Romans are going to rename. So those are some of the early battles that tend not to be really, they're ones that the Maccabeans win them, but they're not very decisive. But then what happens in 164 is the Battle of Beth Zur, and this is where finally the Maccabeans are able to field a significant army to go up against the Seleucids, and they win, and they defeat a large Seleucid force, And as a result of that, Judas Maccabeus is able to enter into Jerusalem and take over Jerusalem. So there's this triumphant entry, and he doesn't ride on a colt or anything like that, but he has this triumphant entry into Jerusalem where there's adulation of the crowds and stuff. It's kind of a mixed bag, though, because there is actually still a Seleucid garrison inside of a fortress inside of Jerusalem. So he enters into Jerusalem and he's in control of the city, except that right in the middle of the city is a fortified Greek garrison that is not gone. They're still there. And so they basically end up stuck in there with him, sort of besieging that garrison for quite a long time. That same year, 165, is the ritual cleansing of the 10 temples. So the Jews have to clean out all of the influences of the Greek culture that got into the temple. So they go through the process of doing a ritual cleansing on 25 Kislev. That is one of the Jewish months. And it is also during this period of time that Hanukkah occurs. Anybody know the story of Hanukkah? We're all reaching back from when we were elementary school and we did like weird little paper projects, which is a long time ago for most of us. So
Tell me about it.
yeah, for more so for some of us than others. So Hanukkah, it's called it's a celebration of lights. There is this process of lighting candles that is part of the Jewish ritual cleansing and rededication process, and the story goes that these candles, I say candles, lamps is the correct word. These lamps use ritual oil that is specially prepared, which is true. You can actually find the ingredients for that oil listed in one of the books of the Torah, where there's this detailed thing about the oils that are used to anoint the priests and the oils that are used to burn in the worship and stuff like that. So the only, according to the legend of Hanukkah, the only store, by store I don't mean like Circle K store, I mean like a storage place. The only place that was left, there was only enough oil for one lamp to burn for one day. And there was necessity that over the course of the cleansing, I misspelled cleansing up there, by the way, I apologize. I just noticed that. Pleasing is not a word. Anyway, over the course of this, it's supposed to go for 8 days, 7 days, I forget, 8 days, I think. And somehow, miraculously, supposedly, the oil lasted all 8 days. And so the menorah, which is that multi-candelabra thing, is used to symbolize Hanukkah. There's the central candle that's used to light the other candles one day after another one. And so Hanukkah is a product, whether you believe the myth and the legend about it or not, Hanukkah definitely originates during this period of time, and that is the beginning of the celebration of Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah is not one of the Jewish high festivals. There's the 3 high festivals where all the Jews are supposed to go to Jerusalem, and those continue to be celebrated during this period of time. Hanukkah is a minor thing. It's actually taken on a lot more significance today because of its coincidental timing along with Christmas. And so, for a lot of non-Jews, we think of it as the most important Jewish holiday, after all, because it's right there where Christmas is. And the Jews think that we're a bunch of morons because we don't know anything about their culture. Because, in fact, it's not that important. It's something they celebrate. But compared to the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, it is not that significant. So, in any event, Hanukkah begins during the same period of time. So the Maccabeans are having success. And by the way, it's called the Maccabean Revolt because of, hopefully you figured this out already, Judas Maccabeus is the reason they name it that. Because he's the initial significant leader. Even though Mattathias got it started, Judas is the one who really pushes it forward. And so during this period of time, the governor appointed by the Syrian Jews, Alcimus, revokes the ban on Judaism. So realizing that the situation is not going their way, the Seleucids decide that rather than making matters worse, that they're going to go ahead and back off on the ban of Judaism to allow the Jews to go back to practicing their religion. The idea being that this will make the Jews happy and maybe put an end to the revolution and the uprising, because that seems to have been what's driving it. But it's kind of one of those situations where the situation has gotten too far along for them to just be able to deal with it like that. They're not going away at this point because they've kind of got the bit in their teeth and they're running with it. And so the Seleucids become increasingly desperate to find some way to appease the Jews and get out of this civil war, because they've got their own problems. We'll talk about that in a second here. They've got their own problems. They really can't afford to spend a lot of time and energy on this one little province that's troublesome and causing them all kinds of issues, but it's really not the core of what's going on in their own empire. So the next thing that kind of happens in another attempt to appease the Jews is they execute Menelaus. Now, just out of curiosity to see who was paying attention last week, can anybody tell me who Menelaus was? Excellent. I feel like I'm definitely making a good use of my time with this class. Menelaus was the high priest who had bribed his way into the high priesthood after the more legitimate priest. He may or may not have actually been legitimate in the sense of being a descendant of Aaron, but the priest who was originally and correctly supposed to be in that job, Onias, and then his brother, I forget what his brother's name was now, they had been kicked out basically, and he had been given the job by Antiochus Epiphanes, and so now he is executed by the Seleucids because and there's kind of two sides to it. Number one is it gets rid of one of the things that the Jews are upset about. And the second one is, if you remember, the high priest is kind of the leader of the Jews. And obviously Menelaus is not exactly doing a fantastic job of leading the Jews the way the Seleucids want them to be led. So they decided to get rid of the ineffective leader, again in the hope that maybe that they will be able to deal with him, or deal with the Jews. But that's not what happened. So instead, I mentioned there's a fortress inside of Jerusalem that's been built by the Seleucid Greeks. It's called Acra, A-C-R-A. And Judas Maccabeus' forces besiege Acra, and ultimately they are able to force out the garrison there, in no small part because the garrison has no access to fresh water or food supplies. So it doesn't take a really long time before they're able to force them out of there. And so they take over, and now they have complete control of the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so then that same year there's another battle, the Battle of Beth Zur, and the first of Mattathias' sons, Eleazar Avarin, not the first in the sense of the oldest one, but he's the first one to be killed. He's killed in battle in a fairly heroic way, if the accounts are correct. It appears that the Greeks were using infantry as well as elephants. Elephants were, Hannibal had first discovered those or began to use those in battle in the Europe and the Middle East in, I don't know, 600 or something like that, 500, I forget exact, no, not quite that far back. Anyway, they started using military elephants, which were quite problematic for almost any other kind of armed force at the time, because horses and chariots just didn't really stand up very well against elephants because of their size and because of how robust they were. And so they fielded a small force of elephants, and Eleazar Avarin ran up underneath one, cut it open basically all along its belly, and killed it. The only problem was that the elephant immediately collapsed on him and killed him too. So that was the end of Eleazar's heroic mission there. So I don't know if there's a lesson in there or not, but it's probably, if you're going to kill something huge, make sure you're far enough away that it doesn't fall on you. So anyway, Eleazar dies, and so during the same period of time then, a new king of the Seleucid Greeks takes over, Demetrius I Soter. And so he is taken over. Now, as we're going to see in a minute, I don't want to get into all the details right now because it fits a little better later. What is happening in the Seleucid Empire right now is there's beginning to be this internal conflict between two lineages, two brothers and their descendants are beginning to fight back and forth. And so the situation is that the Jews are having more success than they maybe would have if the empire had been unified, because so much of the empire's attention is focused on this rivalry and this conflict that they can't really afford to divert the kind of resources to the Jews that they would otherwise need to. And here again, there's a lot of parallels to the American Revolutionary War. One of the reasons that the American Revolutionary War was a success is because Britain had a lot of other things on its mind that it was trying to deal with, and it couldn't afford to send the significant majority or a significantly larger force of its ships and soldiers to the colonies. And because of that, a force that never would have been able to succeed against the full might of the British Empire was able to succeed against that smaller group. And that's kind of what's happening here for the Jews as well. So ultimately, at the end of his life, Judas Maccabeus controls this territory, which, when you think about the territory of David and Solomon, is kind of sad. But when you think about the fact that the Jews have not had any control over their own lives for a very long time, it's kind of impressive. Jerusalem is kind of at the center of it. It goes up here. Now, if we think about the land of Israel, when it was under David and Solomon, it would have gone all the way down below this, all the way up over here, and all the way up, you can't even see it, but all the way up there. So this is a fraction of what David and the combined tribes and the kingdom of David and Solomon were. But it is the first time in wow, how long has it been? It's the first time in almost, I don't know, 450 years that the Jews have had control, true control over their own land, basically at all. So, okay, so during this same period of time, then a guy named Alcimus or Alcimus is appointed high priest. He's appointed, I'm not exactly sure who appointed him to this position. I actually think it was the Seleucids. They're still appointing, but he was much more acceptable to the people of Jerusalem, and so they didn't rebel against him the way they did. But there continue to be battles. Now, one of the battles that happens is the Battle of Edessa, which doesn't go actually very, very well. Judas Maccabeus loses pretty badly in that particular battle, and as a result of that, he seeks to try to open negotiations with Rome to create some kind of a peace treaty with them, or a treaty with them, because he knows that having Rome at your back can be really useful. After all, that was what drove the Seleucids out of Egypt, was having Rome show up. So he begins to contact or have interactions with Rome. He's not able to get a treaty. The best he's able to do is kind of a vaguely worded contract that suggests that they might help out if they feel like it, is basically how it goes. And so, not too long after that, in 160, there's the Battle of Edessa. Judas Maccabeus is killed, and Jerusalem is recaptured by the Seleucid Greeks. There's a whole series of battles that are fought during this period of time and during Judas Maccabeus' lifetime. Most all of them, here's Jerusalem, almost all of them are fought in and around the area around Jerusalem. They are of greater and lesser significance, but the primary focus of most of these battles, particularly for the Jews, is maintaining or recapturing control of Jerusalem, because we've talked about this before. Jerusalem is the center of the Jews' political and ethnic and religious identity, and so the control of Jerusalem is probably more important to them than any other tactical or strategic goal. All right, let's see. Okay, so Judas Maccabeus, as I said, he died in 160. He is succeeded by his brother Jonathan Apphus, who's the youngest of the five sons of Mattathias, but they kind of did this out of order. I don't know exactly why. I guess it was just kind of who wanted it the most. So Jonathan Apphus takes over, and during that same period of time, a year later, actually the same year basically, that Judas is killed, John Gotti is killed by the sons of Jambri during a mission to the Nabalians. He was sent to this group of people that had been allies previously of the Maccabeans, and he was killed by treachery by another group that intercepted him along the way, which is kind of like a scene from The Godfather now that I think about it. So there's kind of some weird parallels there. Anyway, so John Gotti is killed. So now three of Mattathias' original five sons have been killed, and the only ones that are left are Jonathan Apphus and Simon Thassi. So Jonathan Apphus is able to fight a series of battles and negotiate a ceasefire with Bacchides, who is the general of the Seleucid Greek at this time. The king has better things to do. He sends this general Bacchides down there. Bacchides has some initial success against Jonathan Apphus' forces, but eventually Jonathan sort of wears him down with the guerrilla tactics and things like that. And because of that, there's a ceasefire negotiated, and the Jews are able to sort of live in peace. Now, they don't have control of the cities. The Seleucids continue to control the cities and on the fortified towns and things like that. But in the countryside, the Jews are basically doing whatever they want to. And they've kind of set up a shadow government. So the Seleucids have their governor, they have their general, who's kind of the guy who's in charge of the military, obviously, in that area. And at the same time, the Jews have set up their own government in the countryside, and they have set up they have their own general. Jonathan Apphus is kind of serving as the general, and they are kind of controlling the countryside. So there's kind of this split thing, but what it eventually kind of boils down to is that, so the green here is the territory that Judas Maccabeus was able to conquer. Jonathan Apphus is able to extend that territory out into these other areas. Now, if you look on here, these dots are by and large fortified cities. So the dots are areas he didn't have any control over. This is Samaria up here. This is Edom or Idumea down here. He doesn't have control in there, but he is able to expand the territory, particularly in areas where there aren't any fortified cities of the Seleucids. And so Jonathan begins to grow the territory again. So from about basically 160 to 153, that's what's happening, is there's these rival governments. There's the Seleucid government that is in the cities, and there is the Jewish government that is out in the countryside. But again, there's stuff going on in the Seleucid Empire that's making this an increasingly problematic situation. I don't know how well you remember. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And Antiochus IV was not a legitimate king of the Syrian Jews, although he was one of the most successful of them, ironically. He was the brother of the man who was actually king. And when that guy died, his son took over, or supposed to take over, but he was just a child. And so Antiochus was able to come in and kind of shove him out of the way and take over the throne and usurp the throne. But that didn't wipe out the line of, he didn't have that son executed. And so what happens is you start to have these rival lines. One is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the other one is his brother's son, Seleucus IV Philopator, and these two start having kids. And so Demetrius the first is one of the kings who is the son of the original ruler, the one who had the legitimate right to it. And he becomes the ruler and gets enough power that he's kind of in charge, but he's got so much going on dealing with his, I guess it would be his uncle, and with the resources that are necessary to deal with Antiochus Epiphanes and his descendant, a guy named Alexander I Ballus, that he ends up deciding to withdraw all of his troops because he just can't afford to have them there. The only place he leads any troops is in Jerusalem and Beth Zur. Beth Zur was the site of the battle that allowed the Jews to gain control of Jerusalem, so they don't want to do that again, and they leave a garrison in Jerusalem as well. But other than that, they completely leave Judea because they just can't afford to expend the energy to fight these battles. And in the meantime, Jonathan initially allies himself with Demetrius I, Jonathan, the son of Mattathias. Initially, he allies himself with Demetrius I, but then Antiochus IV's successor, a guy named Alexander I Ballus, promises him better terms, so he immediately switches over to that guy, and that guy gives him, basically a title and recognition and everything, and sort of backs him up, which leads to the garrison being removed, and it also leads to Jonathan being appointed high priest. And if you remember, they are of a priestly family, so they have a legitimate claim to the title. But the previous high priest, I forget if he died of old age or died because somebody killed him. Either way, he's no longer in the picture. So Alexander I Ballus sets Jonathan up as the new high priest. So once he does that, though, he pretty much loses his power, and Demetrius I is successful. Then Demetrius I's son, Demetrius II, takes over, at which point Jonathan switches his alliance back to Demetrius, the Demetrius line. So this is not covering some of the glory exactly in terms of his political allegiances, but it is kind of working because he keeps playing these two sides off against each other, and the result is that the Seleucids are more and more disinterested in Jerusalem and in Judea because they've got other things to deal with. And so he's both made enemies and friends out of these guys, and the net result is that they're getting further and further away, and the Jews are having more and more control. So however you feel about it, this is working for them. So we have the line of the people that have the legitimate claim to the kingship, and then we have another line. Alexander I Ballus is succeeded by a guy named Diodotus Tryphon, who's actually initially the governor of Judea. And he's going to become one of the rivals for the kingship of the Seleucid Empire. But, let's see, how does this go? Okay, so Demetrius I is succeeded by Alexander I. Theophilus Euergetes, who's actually the same guy as Alexander Ballus, he just gave himself a fancier name when he became the king. And during this period of time, there's finally pretty much a total withdrawal from Jerusalem and Judea, and Judea becomes a suzerainty. Now, what a suzerainty is basically a nation or a location that has self-rule while they are still ostensibly under the control of a larger and more powerful nation. In this case, the reality was that Judea basically had total self-government. They didn't have to pay taxes, they didn't pay anything to the Seleucids, not because the Seleucids didn't think they owed it to them, because they just couldn't afford to collect it right now. They didn't have to deal with the Seleucid armies because the Seleucids were too busy fighting amongst themselves. So they basically got to do whatever they wanted to. They got to control their own destiny for a period of time. It's during this time that Diodotus Tryphon becomes the governor of Judea, but he's kind of governor in name only because he doesn't have any army to back him up or anything else. So he invites Jonathan Apphus to come and have a conference with him to talk about kind of how to deal with these things. and what to do with the land, and Jonathan goes and he gets assassinated. So, bingo. So good work there. So Diodotus is actually a fairly shrewd politician, it turns out, and Diodotus ultimately will go from the governorship of Judea and turn that into a claim to the throne of the Seleucid Empire. And we're not going to talk about that because that's not our problem. That's not part of our story here right now. So Jonathan Apphus is assassinated. He is succeeded by his brother Simon Thasi, the last of the last of Mattathias' sons that are still alive. Simon Thasi takes over. So at this point we've gone through two of three brothers, sons of Mattathias, have been in control of of Jerusalem and Judea. Two other ones have died, and the two other ones that were also rulers have also died. So we're down to the last guy, Simon Thasi. It's during this period of time that Simon is able to get a formal exemption from the Seleucids regarding taxes, which is kind of the last big thing. And then finally, the Seleucids agree to return full control of Jerusalem and Beth Zur to the Jews. So they're not only are the garrisons gone, but basically they just said, we're done. You can just do it yourself. So they're at this point, they truly are self-governing. They're not really under the control of the Seleucids at all, although formally the Seleucids would still call them part of the empire. As a practical reality, Jerusalem and Judea is now under the control of the Jews exclusively, which is the first time they've been fully in control of their territory since they were taken into captivity in Babylon. Simon is elected the high priest in 141. So his brother, of course, died in 143. He was the high priest. The office was vacant. Now what's interesting is that even though a big part of the Maccabean revolt is a revolt against Greek customs and Greek ideas and all the different stuff, Simon is actually voted on in a very Greek-style election by the Jews, and he's elected high priest. So they adopted the Greek method of electing somebody to get their high priest, and Simon becomes the high priest. And then in 139, Rome recognizes Jerusalem or Judea as an independent state and opens up formal, what's the word I'm looking for? Formal consular relationship with them, basically recognizing them as a real government and having a relationship with them, which is not as good as having a treaty, but it also is kind of nice to know that the kind of the big bully on the block is at least recognizing that you have the right to exist. So
the Seleucids have given over to the Romans. The Romans have stepped in a little further.
Well, the Romans have stepped in further. They have not taken over the Seleucid Empire yet, but the Romans are progressively eating up the territory of what used to be Alexander the Great's territory. If you remember, and I don't have a copy of the map here, but if you remember the map of Alexander the Great's territory, he started off over here in Greece and Macedonia, and then he expanded outward. And so Macedonia is the first of his territories here, and then there's a secondary territory that was controlled by, I believe it's Cassander, controlled the second territory. Then the biggest one by far was the Seleucid Greek Empire that began kind of in Asia Minor and stretched all the way over into the Middle East and even beyond that, and all the way down to Palestine. Those were the Seleucids, and then down at the bottom were the Ptolemies, the Egyptian Greeks in there. So what has happened is that over time, by now, Rome has conquered Macedonian Greece, and they have conquered the Cassander section of Greece as well. They are on the verge of having a puppet government in Egypt, although Egypt is still technically independent, and they are eating into the territory of the Seleucids up in Asia Minor. So the Seleucids have lost control of most of Asia Minor, the northern part of their territory, and increasingly their control is over what used to be Babylonia and Persia, all the way down to the edge of Judea. And so the Romans are growing and growing and becoming more and more powerful.
Where's the headquarters of the Seleucids?
Okay, so the Seleucids' headquarters in Antioch, the same one that Paul and Barnabas will be dispatched from on their missionary journey. If you think about the Mediterranean is kind of the edge of the Mediterranean is here. Jerusalem and Judea is down here. Antioch is up just below kind of where the Mediterranean turns around. It's up in that area there. That is their initial capital. they eventually, as the Romans encroach more and more, they end up moving to Susa, which was the former capital of the Persian Empire, which is moreover kind of in this central landmass over there, kind of where the Beth would be on the imaginary map that I've constructed up there. So hopefully you can sort of imagine along with me. So they have to move their capital because the Romans are encroaching, and then you can't have you don't want your capital to be like 40 feet from the territory that your rivals control. And at this point, it's become very clear, I think, to most people who are aware of what's going on, that the Romans are coming, and the Romans are just about like an unstoppable force now. It's just a question of how long it's going to take them to conquer, not a question of whether they're going to. Their style of war, their success, their size, and their money and resources are such that none of the countries that they're facing really expect themselves to be able to stand up against them. So, okay, yes.
Why do you think that we don't have any inspired writings from this period?
Why do I think that? I mean,
They didn't have time to write
right.
anything down?
Well, the facile answer would be because God didn't have anything he wanted to say.
Yeah.
It's a good question. It's interesting because if the Bible were simply a collection of things written by men that were claiming inspiration, it would make no sense whatsoever for us to not have any inspired writings. And there are definitely writings during this time. There are actually 2 books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are written about this revolution. And they are significantly historical. They are backed up by other aspects of history, but they also contain a significant element of mythology and mysticism. And so even the Jews don't include them in their own canon. Although they kind of got them as like an appendix where you might want to go read this in case you want to know about our history kind of a thing. I think that...
I guess my question is, we focus on this intertestament period, 400 years. It's like a huge focus point for a lot of us, but we do have gaps along the way throughout the Bible, but for some reason this is very prominent. And I don't know if it's because we had lost Jerusalem and then all of a sudden we have it back in the New Testament. I don't know.
I think that the biggest issue is that there is such a profound change between where we leave the story at the end of Nehemiah and Ezra and Malachi and where we pick it up again, to where you would almost think that there was this isn't even the same place and the same locations and stuff anymore, and yet it clearly is. And so in a lot of ways, but in addition to that, you have a much more rigorous and real history being recorded. The other times that we have gaps, it's prehistoric, except that the Bible itself is talking about those gaps. And so we actually know a lot more about what happened during this period of time, even though there may not have been direct inspiration going on there. Okay. Jerry?
I got another theory.
Okay.
That there wasn't any need for it.
Okay.
We see prophecies throughout the prophets talking about Jerusalem, or the Jews coming back, and that they would recognize God after the Babylonian captivity, that they would be coming back, and that they would identify with God, and they wouldn't turn to idols. Well, we see that happen during that 400 years, or at least in the last 200 years of it. And the other thing is, all of the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah had been repeated several times by the prophets, Isaiah particularly.
Yeah.
And what was left to be said? I mean, what was needed to be said? Well, it had already been told that the Messiah was coming, and it had already been told that the Jewish nation would be, the people would be there, not the nation, not I mean that as a nation, but the people would recognize God. So I guess I've never considered that there was a need for that 400 years to have God talking to people until Matthew chapter 1.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, if the prophecy is of the Messiah would seem to be all that God wanted to say on the issue, and would seem to be enough, and the prophecies about, as you said, the return of the Jews and things that we see in Daniel, would seem to set up the scene to the point where there's not necessarily anything else to be said except more specificity, which God was not intending to give. So, for whatever reason, God decides to be silent. Now, the other thing I would point out is that the previous time in the Scriptures that we see a gap in God's interaction with man is between essentially the casting out of Adam and Eve from the garden through the flood. And the exact length of time, if you do it where you count it strictly based on the lifespans of the people who are, one to the next, I forget, what is it?
I was thinking 600 years, but it may have been more than
A little more than that, but something like that. If you believe as I do that it's more likely that those are talking about so-and-so was the ancestor of so-and-so, which would make it a lot more palatable from the standpoint of what we know from archaeological history. But either way, there's this extended period of time where God has no contact with man. And what's interesting is to see what happens during that period of time.
Even in the Judges, there seems to be very little direct contact.
Well, yes and no. I mean, he's inspiring people to do things. The
Yes.
Spirit is acting on people. Deborah and others are prophesying.
They are.
And there's no reason to think that there may not have been others that were also doing that. Whereas during the period of time between the people being... Cain is the last one recorded in the Scriptures of having a conversation with God before Noah does. Now, that doesn't mean that no one else was. And certainly the fact that, what's his name, Enoch was taken up to heaven might suggest that he had a very close relationship with God. And what you see happening during that period between Cain and Abel and the flood is at best sort of a thread of humanity, a very small thread of humanity that still is trying to maintain a relationship with God, and God has basically stepped out of the affairs of man. And there's almost a sense in which God is reacting to what happened in the garden and saying, you know what? You think you know it all now? You think you can understand it? You think you can handle it on your own? Let's see how it goes. And just sort of turns man over to sin and to being man, and lets it get worse and worse and worse and worse to prove what happens when man doesn't have any direct intervention from God. It creates a chaotic and awful situation. The difference between that and the 430 years between the two testaments is that in that case there's now a recorded set of laws and rules and revelations from God. There is now a nation that identifies itself specifically as God's people, and that is now actually doing what they were supposed to do all along, which is to try to maintain that relationship and do what God wants. And so there's not the same kind of generalized lawlessness in the absence of anything but a tiny little thread. There's actually a more focused and concerted effort to follow God, at least among the Jews there. But I think that one of the things that does create, and the absence of any additional revelation does create, is an anticipation for the Messiah. An anticipation for God to do something, because he hasn't been doing anything. Now he gives the Maccabeans success in their revolution, and he gives them their own state, but that's quickly taken away from, I hate to spoil this for you, it's quickly taken away from them by Rome. We're going to get to that next couple of weeks here. So they don't get to keep it for very long. And so even though there's some things that are happening that are good for the Jews, overall things aren't very good for them. And what it's doing, I think, is creating this anticipation. God has been silent for all this time. And you know how it is. People who tend to remain silent, when they do talk, most of us tend to pay more attention because they haven't been talking all the time. Now, if they start talking and they say something really dumb, then maybe that ends real fast. But by and large, people who tend to keep quiet do so because they want to wait until they've got something important to say. So that may be kind of what's going on here as well, is that God is sort of priming the pump so that people will be really excited and really looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, because that is part and parcel of the fullness of time that we see in the Scriptures, is that anticipation of the Messiah's arrival, in addition to just the necessary preconditions having been met for him to come there.
Even if they didn't accept the fact.
Well, just because they had a wrong way it was going to, just because they had a wrong way it was going to look like, doesn't change the fact that they had anticipation.
Yeah.
So I want to finish with a couple quick things here. So Rome recognizes the Judea as an independent state. In 139 to 138, a Seleucid army tries to take it back over again, but they are repulsed by forces led by Simon Thassi, and so they continue to have their self-rule. During this period of time, of course, Simon is the high priest. He is also the leader of the Jews. The title that he is given is either Nasi, which is basically prince, or president, depending on kind of how you kind of interpret the word in context. And he's also referred to as an ethnarch, which means governor. So he is not taking the title king. He is at most claiming to be prince, but not a prince in the sense of prince who will later become king. Prince in the sense of not the king, but the ruler, kind of a thing. This is an important distinction because later on, the Hasmoneans who are descended from the Maccabeans are going to assume the role of king, and that's going to become a major sticking point. But that's not for today. We're going to take a break, and we will get back together in, I don't know, 13 or 14 minutes here. So thank you guys for your participation.